All right, how you like this program tonight so far? Okay, no pressure, Jim. Everything will be fine. Since I didn't get to make an acceptance speech today, I'm going to do it now. And it's just one thing. I want to thank my wonderful, beautiful wife, Dorianne, for her unending support, being my wife and my biggest supporter. And I know that's not an easy thing to be the minister's wife or spouse or partner. And I really appreciate it. And she's also now the president of the board of the Science of Mind Archives. So, wonderful. So, evolving right along, I want to talk about evolution, but maybe not in a way that you're used to hearing it. And I want to talk about the idea of integral. And these two words, evolution and integral, are emerging in new ways around the world and in spirituality. This little cartoon kind of speaks to kind of an old idea of evolution. It's, if you can't see it, it says, I was wondering when you would discover there's lots more steps. That despite how we might see ourselves, we're not the end of evolution. That in terms of biological evolution, which is the way we're mostly used to listening to it or hearing about it, we're not the end. We're a step in the process. So what is evolution today? Evolution today is seen as the idea of emergence in so many different areas of life. Emergence in psychology, emergence in culture, emergence in spirituality, the way things are arriving and showing up, not that we are bringing them into being, but that these new ideas, new possibilities, new expressions are using us to come into being. That we are the vessels for these ideas. And when you look back to some of the earliest writings of Dr. Holmes in his earliest books, oh, I've never seen myself on the big screen. Okay. In some of his earliest writings, he talked about that we have access to all of the ideas in the universe. Now, how could that be unless those ideas were also coming into being, that we're part of something bigger? We're part of something that is emerging. And it gets more interesting as we go along. This is a rather long statement, but basically it says that integral thought is claimed to provide a new understanding of how evolution affects the development of consciousness and culture. It includes areas such as business, education, medicine, spirituality, sports, psychology, and psychotherapy. The idea of the evolution of consciousness has also become a central theme in much of integral theory. So who are the people that are doing this? Who are the evolutionaries? Well, we have Ken Wilber. Many of you know of his work, one of the great current contemporary philosophers. Barbara Marx Hubbard. Carter Phipps, who has a new book out I really recommend. It's called Evolutionaries, and Carter is the former editor-in-chief of Enlightened Next magazine. Bruce Sanguin, who you'll be seeing tomorrow, and don't miss his presentation. One of the true evolutionaries in the spirituality arena. Gene Houston, okay, one of the great minds of our time, one of the most brilliant people I've ever encountered, who is continually in evolutionary mode. It's almost exhausting to be around her. Don Beck, who is one of the people that have carried spiral dynamics theory into the modern era. And old Charlie, who got things rolling. Darwin. So what Darwin saw, and by the way, evolutionary theory began a couple of hundred years before Darwin. But what Darwin began to see was that things change, things evolve, and he began to look at how does that happen. And he was working in the observable world. He was working in biology. He was looking at animals and different species and looking at fossils and things like that. But today we look at that same idea and we find that not only has the idea of evolutionary biology shifted tremendously, but these new arenas have opened up where we're looking at everything through an evolutionary lens, including us. Now, this is not a fad. This is an emerging paradigm, a new way to understand reality. Let me give you an idea of what it might look like. And I'm going to set this down for a minute. So let's look at our own movement, our own religious science movement. You might say it began as a small circle with Ernest's original ideas that he was talking to Fenwick and a few other people about. And in the early years, there was a small circle of people that were really in the know, and that circle began to grow to more and more people as he began to teach and he began to speak, and his writings became more prolific. And as more people came into that circle, the circle began to change. And if you think of time, a sort of a timeline or an intentionality toward a greater future moving this way, toward change, it began to shift into more of an oval. And there was a leading edge and a trailing edge. And the leading edge began to move forward. And these were people who sort of naturally moved into an idea of let's look at what's next. Let's look at new possibilities. And the trailing edge tends to be people who say, let's really hold what we've got, let's honor what is. And you, by the way, every entity will have both. If you had all leading edge, you'd fly off the face of the planet. But if you have all trailing edge, you don't go anywhere. And the trouble is, as this little oval is sort of moving through, the world around it is also moving. And the universe around it is also moving. Evolution, everything is changing. The universe we live in is becoming more complex. Evolution seems to be the device by which the creative intelligence of the universe manifests. And it can seem to be glacial at times because you were the result of 14 billion years or so of evolution. But there are also times when it goes very quickly. It goes in fits and starts. So as we move through and we move through our history, we've remained sort of that oval shape, and we've had people, we've kind of sped up and slowed down, and we've sped up and we've slowed down. But while we've been doing that, the world around us has been speeding up and speeding up and speeding up and speeding up. Have you noticed? Now, Emil mentioned that we first met around 2004, 2005, and these didn't exist really then. Some of us had flip phones or something like that. I remember my dear friend Karen Kushner had like a 1990s brick with a big... So in the last 7 or 8 years now, how many don't have one of these, a smartphone? And I can't see your hand, so I'm assuming there's probably a few up. How long did your parents have their telephone before they traded it in for a new one? All right? Maybe they had 2 phones their whole life. One when they went from dial to push button was the only time they changed. Or if you're a little older, when they went from crank to dial. Otherwise, the phone was just there and it was stuck to the wall. And if you weren't home, you weren't on the phone. And it lasted that way for a long time. And all of a sudden, if you've had a phone 6 months, you're like, oh man, I got to get a new phone. Well, that's just one example, and that's a technology-driven example, but the same thing is happening in culture. I don't know how they measure this, I have no idea, but they say that the total amount of human knowledge is now doubling every 3 to 6 months. In 1990, it was doubling every 3 years. Okay? So you're right, you don't know a lot. Nobody does. That's why we have the smartphone, to see, what the hell, what's happened since I came in here? But all seriousness aside, Abraham Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." Now, you could give that same statement on steroids today. And he was talking about a past that was centuries old. We're talking about a past of a few years. Things are speeding up. In order to stay anywhere near the leading edge of the curve as a movement, the whole oval has to kind of be near the leading edge. It's not just enough for a few people to be out there because the distance will get too great. Once the leading edge gets too far from the trailing edge, they can't communicate anymore. We're seeing that in the American government right now. I don't know what's going on in Canada, but I suspect the same thing is emerging. Of the folks that say we don't like change, digging in, and they fall farther and farther behind because the whole system is moving. And by the way, we do have dogma. Oh yeah, honey, we do. Try taking a practitioner exam and saying you don't believe what we say and see if you'll get a license. But that's another talk for another time. Bruce Sanguin, in his book Emerging Church, which is really a good book, says the capacity and the willingness to presense and presence the future that needs the congregation in order to emerge is what the spiritual leader needs to recognize. The function of the modern spiritual leader is in part to see what wants to come through your membership. And how can you help facilitate them to be clear vessels of the wisdom that is seeking to emerge? And through yourself, and through your leadership, and through this whole organization. The demands of the world are becoming more complex, whether we like it or not. It just is. I was watching a TED Talk today, and the gentleman was talking about the idea that what they're finding is, and I don't know how they measure this either, that 2/3 to 3/4 of modern Americans are overwhelmed by the nature of the world they find themselves in, by the complexity that they find themselves in. Overwhelmed. So they turn to things that trigger dopamine in the brain, which keeps you occupied and lets you think you're doing something productive when you're not. I'll let you figure out what those things are. No, but things like being online all day long and not really doing anything except being online all day long. You know, spending hours with Tumblr, going through photo after photo after photo after photo. There's one pornographic site, I won't give you the name of it because you probably already know it, that gets 4.5 billion discrete hits per month. There's 7 billion people on the planet. You do the math. 30% of the data transmitted on the internet is pornography. Now, what's going on there is not that there's a bunch of perverts out there, although that may be true as well. What's going on is people are seeking to set the dopamine loose in their brain because they can't deal with the world they live in. What will Center for Spiritual Living be like in 5, 10, or 20 years? You ever think about that? If all knowledge is doubling every 3 to 6 months, and that, by the way, that is accelerating, in 20 years it may be doubling every few minutes. What do we study? And by the way, I'm sure we took some of the young adults to lunch today. in that wonderful program, please do that. And if you can't do it here, take some to lunch where you live, some of your own young adults and teens, and find out what's on their mind. And they can use the food. But Dorian and I took them to lunch, and we asked the question, what do you think of the textbook? And there was this big delay. There was a moment of silence while, and I was trained in law enforcement to look at eye responses and tell where people are going. And there's a certain place your eyes go when you're going to need to make up a story. And they were going there. And then there were sideways glances to each other, like, do you think they're serious? Should we really say, And it was kind of an awkward 25 seconds. It was probably 5 seconds. It just seemed like 25. And I said, I think there's problems with it because anyone under 35 that I've introduced it to doesn't read it. And they went, oh, you're so right. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the textbook. And it also doesn't mean that if you love the textbook and you're 65 years old, that there's something wrong with the current school system. Because when you came into Science of Mind, if you're 65 years old and someone had handed you something written in 1300, which is about the same in terms of rate of change, you'd be stuck in Middle English at best, right? Beowulf, yeah, oh God. Then we got into this really incredibly animated conversation about what could we create in terms of teaching material. There might be multimedia that would incorporate Dr. Holmes' ideas and put videos and graphic novels and whatever else that young people would be drawn to and attracted to. And they got this. There was this incredible energy around the table, and they said, "When you start doing that project, we want in." Yeah. And I said, my only fear is by the time we finish the project, that'll be obsolete. But that doesn't mean you don't start. We got to stop making stuff that can't change. Now, let's go back to the oval. Okay, if you find leading edge, trailing edge, and everything is happening in this oval. Everything's happening. Diversity's happening, education's happening, centers moving and opening, using branding, not using branding is happening, and all that other stuff is happening in that oval, all within that thing that represents where we are. And there's some leading edge folks looking at it in all the areas, and some folks are leading edge in some areas and trailing edge in others, and some are in the middle, just where they are. I know I'm at the leading edge, and I know why, because it's where I prefer to be. It's a personal preference. It just suits me. And what I've got to be careful is to say, well, if you're not up here with me, there's something wrong with you. Come on, let's get going. When I wrote the original memo about integration, I said, we can do this in 12 months. Come on, this is nothing. And I thought that was being conservative. And it only took 9 years. And such is life, right? So today at the business meeting, people are, the leadership's up here, and people are saying, why isn't this stuff done? Well, because you're not doing it. Maybe that's part of it. And I'm not trying to, I'm just be clear. It's not that we don't have good leadership, it's that we refuse to be led. We did that. This is from Dr. Holmes. Many of you may have heard of him. And this is the famous Sermon by the Sea, 1959, his last speech at Asilomar, when I think he had some prescience that it might be his last one. When he talked about, give me 1,000 people that get the teaching and so forth. Well, this is another quote from that talk. He says, others will arise who will know more than we do. They won't be better or worse. They will be different and know more than we do. Evolution is forward. A lot's happened in the world of spirituality since 1960. A lot's happened in all of the fields that support us in terms of psychology, in terms of sociology, in terms of science and cosmology, and all the things we look to for the support of our principles as we understand them. If we don't incorporate not only the new stuff, but the leading edge new stuff on a regular basis, we will fall farther and farther behind. And we will not attract the people that will carry us into the leading edge, which it used to be easy to be on the leading edge. You had to just be able to think for yourself, which was a big deal in the 1940s and 50s. Now it's not such a big deal. It's more common that people think for themselves. And if somebody is really sharp and really looking at what's going on in the world and they're tuned to complexity, if they come walking into your center, do you have anything to hold them there? Or are you still doing whatever you're doing? I don't want to say anything specific. Does it look like an Episcopal church in 1955? That's as general as I'm going to be. I'm not going to say anything about the Our Father. Evolution is happening, and we are either consciously directing it or we are unconsciously reacting to it. Barbara Marx Hubbard and others have talked about what's the big awakening in the evolutionary theory is that we are now capable of consciously directing our own evolution, of creating what is the next human species that Barbara calls Homo universalis. We are either consciously, and here's the truth, we're consciously directing it either way. All of us, now let's get back to the oval, okay? You're in the oval, whether you like it or not. Okay, if you're here, you're in the oval, okay? The oval is being consciously directed by the collective within the oval. James Mellon said it yesterday. Whatever you're doing, you're creating your own experience, and we're co-creating each other's experience, aren't we? Has anybody irritated you while you've been here? They're co-creating your experience, right? Okay. Need to move on. Conscious evolution, we did that. We will act cooperatively to co-create our future, or will we take a more independent approach? And now the more independent approach is not necessarily the wrong way. But if we all go off in our own direction, we lose coherence. And if we lose coherence, what's the point of meeting? What's the reason to come together, either virtually or in person, if we're not coherent, if we're not at least generally going in the same direction? Now, I don't mean the old style of everybody lockstep and following and obeying and all that. That time is past. I'm talking about willingly cooperating because we see the big picture and we see that it works. And that it may not work for everyone. It says insert photo of ceiling lights at Vancouver Airport. And Google image let me down here, but when we were coming in, when we landed at the airport and we're walking in toward immigration and customs and all that, in the ceiling they had the 4-foot fluorescent tubes, but instead of being in straight lines, it looked like initially when you look up, it looked like they were all over the place. They were all at different angles and everything. But as you walked along, you realized, no, there's a pattern. They're generally pointing you where to go. And when there was a hallway over here, a couple of the lights would aim over that way, but the bigger hallway would get the rest of the lights. It was very interesting. They weren't in lockstep. They weren't uniformly aligned, but they were going in the same direction. And when we're able to do that, when we're able to bring our individuality into a conscious willingness to be together, then we benefit from the creativity of everyone. We don't say to the leaders, lead us, and then we step back and wait to be led. And then we say, well, that didn't work. What's the matter with the leaders? That's old thinking. It doesn't work anymore. We say, we're in this together. Let's go. And we don't know where we're going either, folks. Nobody knows where we're going. That's the old systems that got us here can't get us any further. We're in uncharted waters, we're in new territory, but we have the tools to navigate these waters. Alvin Toffler said this over a decade ago before he passed away. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. I didn't say it, he did. Ernest Holmes in The Science of Mind says the spiral of life is upward. Evolution carries us forward, not backward. Eternal and progressive expansion is its law, and there are no breaks in the continuity. We don't get to stop and take a breather. The world continues forward. The universe continues forward. It must be okay. We're here. The universe cannot give us anything that's beyond our capacity to surmount. So if it's in your life, it's yours. I could be wrong. If you're not thinking that all the time, you've got a problem. Because when you say, I know I'm right, you're in trouble. The principles we know are true, but how we apply those principles is going to be a continual moving target as we go forward. We're stepping off the precipice into a time that has never existed, where the universe is moving at a speed it's never moved at before. Man, it's fantastic. Thank you, and namaste.